Guys, as we wrap up chapter 17, we're going to talk about more about the methods of persuasion and two main points that really conclude the chapter. Um, the first point is about it comes after you've established credibility. Um, you decided which evidence you want to use throughout your speech to persuade your audience, and within that, you have your rationale or your reasoning that supports that evidence. So after you have all three of those things, you want to begin to make sure that you don't run into what I like to call a roadblock. It could be a roadblock in your speech, meaning that what we're going to talk about, the roadblock here, is going to be a fallacy, right? Fallacies are things that sometimes we can avoid, sometimes we can't avoid them. And the only way you cannot avoid a fallacy, in my opinion, is if you don't, first of all, recognize what a fallacy is, and then secondly, if you don't practice in order to avoid making those fallacies. So what are fallacies, you're probably wondering? Well, if you turn to page 338, chapter 17, they'll explain it, right? Fallacies are errors in reasoning, right? Fallacies, as I said, there can be a multitude of fallacies that a person encounters. Actually, researchers have found that more than 125 different fallacies exist, right? Errors in reasoning are fallacies, guys. So when we look at the 10 that you should pay most attention to, understand that this is very, very important, because if you've mastered, these 10, then that's 10 less of the 125 that you actually have to remember, just in life in general. But we just want to focus on those 10 fallacies because those are really pertinent to your persuasive speech. So here are the 10 fallacies that you should avoid. Let's start with number 1. Now, number 1 is called the fallacy of hasty generalization. A fallacy of hasty generalization is one in which a speaker jumps to a general conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence. So as a speaker, you're committing a hasty generalization, that type of a fallacy, when you jump to a conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence. So let's delve more deeply into this, okay? Now, a hasty generalization is the most common fallacy in reasoning from specific instances. It occurs when a speaker jumps to a conclusion on the basis of too few cases or on the basis of an atypical case. For instance, here's an example. Throughout American history, military leaders have always made excellent presidents. Look at the examples of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Dwight Eisenhower. Well, Washington, Jackson, and Eisenhower are widely regarded as outstanding chief executives, but are these examples enough to conclude that military leaders always make excellent presidents? Absolutely not. That's just like when people say, well, I know that African American people like hip hop because my two friends who are black like hip hop. Well, just because your two friends who are black like hip hop does not mean that every single African American likes hip hop. That's a hasty generalization, and you want to avoid that, okay? So, then we move down to what's called a false cause. A false cause is a fallacy in which a speaker mistakenly assumes that because one event follows another, the first event is the cause of the second. Okay? Well, that's not always the case. Okay? This is it. In other words, what the author wants you to get from this is that the fact that one event occurs after another does not mean that the first is the cause of the second. Think about your parents, for instance, right? Just because they had you were the first child, does not mean that because of you, they wanted a second child, right? It could be the case, right? But it is not. You're not the sole reason why that your second brother or sister came to be born. No, there are many other factors that went into that, outside of just it being about you. Okay. And then you have a fallacy called invalid analogy. And an invalid analogy is an analogy in which the two cases being compared are not essentially alike, right? So comparing apples and oranges, for instance, just because they're both fruit does not mean that apples are just like oranges. No, they have so many different qualities, right? For instance, apples are not as acidic as oranges. Some apples are, you know, some apples are different colors that oranges may not be the same colors, right? There are, that's an invalid analogy, depending on how you're using it, okay? So here's another example that the author gives you, okay? An invalid analogy occurs when the two cases being compared are not essentially alike. Once again, here's an example. Employees are like nails. Just as nails must be hit on the head to get them to work, so must employees. Now, we know that if you hit an employee, like, you'll get fired. So that's not a really good analogy, and it's also invalid because we know that if you hit someone, even if you tried it, they're less likely to do any work. They're probably going to want to fight you. So although nails can be hit, right, employees cannot be hit, so that in order for them to do more work. No, that's a fallacy. So let's move right into the fourth example of a fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy is that in which assumes that because something is popular, it is therefore good, correct, or desirable. How often have you heard someone say, "It's a great idea. Everyone agrees with it," right? That's a classic example of the bandwagon fallacy, because something is popular does not mean that it's good or desirable or correct, right? Much advertising in the world today is based on the bandwagon fallacy. The fact that more people use Tylenol than Advil does not prove that Tylenol is better at killing pain. No. Tylenol's popularity could be due to clever marketing, right? The company may just have more money to put on more commercials, and the more commercials that an individual sees, the more likely they are to buy that product. And that's why Tylenol, that's probably why Tylenol is used by more people, right? But it doesn't say that it's a better quality product that just because more people use it. Absolutely not. That's a bandwagon assumption, right? And we want to avoid those. Okay. Another is called a red herring. A red herring fallacy is that which introduces an irrelevant issue to divert the attention from the subject under discussion. Okay? A speaker who uses a red herring introduces a relevant issue in order to divert attention from the subject. For instance, how dare my opponents accuse me of political corruption at a time when we are working to improve the quality of life for all people in the United States? What does the speaker's concern about the quality of life in the United States have to do with whether or not he or she is guilty of political corruption, right? It's comparing apples and oranges, right? That's just used as a distraction, right? Talking about the quality of life in the United States. That's distracting the audience from the real issue at hand, which is the political corruption of that particular individual. Okay? Then you have what's called an ad hominem. It's a fallacy that attacks the person rather than dealing with the real issue in dispute. A lot of times in relationships this happens, right? Ad hominem, your boyfriend tells you, your girlfriend tells you to clean up your socks. And perhaps, you get tired of her telling you to clean up your socks. So instead of you addressing the problem, which is that you're probably not a clean person, you say, Why are you always picking on me? Why, why do you like to argue? Why do you like to get on my nerves when I'm watching NFL football? Well, that has nothing to do with the fact that this woman wants a clean house, right? That is an ad hominem. You're attacking the person as opposed to addressing the situation, okay? So here are some other examples that the book uses, right? The head of Commerce Commission has a number of interesting economic proposals, but let's not forget that he or she comes from a very wealthy family. What does that person coming from a very wealthy family have to do with their economic proposals, right? Or no, it has everything to do with their economic proposals, but you want people to concentrate on the fact that he or she's coming from a wealthy family, which they really should be concentrating on the economic proposals, right? For instance, by talking about the commissioner's family background rather than dealing with the subject and the substance of her economic proposals, the speaker is engaging in an ad hominem attack. You're talking about the individual and not the issue at hand. Okay, and so next there's called the either-or fallacy. It forces listeners to choose between two alternatives when more than two alternatives exist. This either-or fallacy is sometimes referred to as a false dilemma. The either-or fallacy forces listeners, like I said, to choose between two alternatives when there are more alternatives that exist. The government must either raise taxes or eliminate services for the poor. That statement is oversimplified because it's a very complex issue to deal with, right? By reducing it to a simple either-or choice, right? Poverty is such a complex issue, guys, that raising taxes may help, but so will education. So will, healthcare. There's so many other issues that can support that particular outcome, right? Benefiting the poor, but the speaker only gives you, one or two of those options, right? And that's not representative of all that could help benefit the poor. Okay. For more information on that particular example, guys, see page 341. And the next fallacy is called the slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy takes its name from the image of a boulder, meaning a big rock, rolling uncontrollably down a steep hill. Once the boulder gets started, it can't be stopped until it reaches the bottom. A speaker who commits the slippery slope fallacy assumes that taking a first step will lead inevitably to a second step, and so on down the slope to disaster. Ignorance on fire. So here's an example. Now that the TSA is allowed to use full body scanners and invasive pat-downs before letting us through security, it's only a matter of time before they start stripping every man and woman and child who wants to fly on the plane. If a speaker claims that taking a first step will inevitably lead to a series of disastrous later steps, he or she needs to provide evidence, right? We're not saying that you can't say that. We're saying that you need to provide evidence or reasoning to support the claim. To assume that all the later steps will occur without proving that they will occur is to commit the slippery slope fallacy, right? That's like someone saying that because you don't, you don't come to class or you don't graduate from college, for instance, that you will not be a multimillionaire, right? Okay, if you don't have evidence to support that being a fact, then how can you make such a generalization, such a statement? You're walking on a slippery slope. Now, you could actually make a reasonable argument saying that if you don't graduate, then you probably won't be a multimillionaire by using evidence, right? Doesn't matter if you're walking on a slippery slope. Just have evidence to back it up. If it's convincing enough evidence, then maybe you won't be in such of a realm of disaster. But if you just try to use a bunch of general what do we call it? hasty generalizations and, you know, a bunch of just if you don't have evidence basically to support that slippery slope that you're embarking upon, then guys, you're really gonna run into a situation where you're not being persuasive, and we can see that you haven't really done due diligence in researching the cause and effect relationships between the argument in which you're trying to come across, okay, or trying to get across rather. And then you have another fallacy is that appealing to traditions. It's a fallacy in which assumes that something old is automatically better than something new. Okay? Here's an example. I don't see any reason to establish the Electoral College. It has been, or abolish the Electoral College. It has been around since the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and we should keep it as long as the United States continues to exist. Well, the Electoral College, guys, is the institution that once we vote in our general elections, they actually, for president, they actually make the final decision based off of how many votes that individual got. So basically, if Obama got more votes in 2012 for his campaign, right, those are the numbers on the paper. It's up to the Electoral College to make the final decision to approve and go with the way of the majority. So if more people voted for Obama, that's great, but it doesn't mean that he's president yet. The Electoral College has to actually approve that the majority wins in that case. So basically what this appeal to tradition is saying is that folks who use this fallacy are walking really on thin ice in a sense that, history, just because something has been around for a long time does not mean it's good. Slavery was around for a number of years and it became a part of the culture, right? So there were some people who were saying, like, listen, we've been doing this for X amount of years. Why should we stop, right? Just because something has been around for a long time does not mean it's good for the duration of mankind. Slavery was a good example of that, right? And then finally, you have appealing to novelty. A fallacy which this is a fallacy which assumes that something new is automatically better than something old. How many times have we seen car commercials that say, buy this new 2014 Audi because, it's the best one since last year's model, right? Well, just because it's new does not mean that it's better, right? Maybe last year's model was made out of titanium, right? The doors were made out of titanium. But this model, they changed it and it's made out of plastic. Well, just because it's new, I'm not going to buy it because I realize that you made some changes in the structure of the car, right? New is not necessarily good, okay? Old is not necessarily good. Those are fallacies, guys, and you want to avoid those when you're speaking. Okay, so in order to be an effective speaker, guys, you want to appeal to emotions. Whether you're doing a persuasive speech, an informative speech, introduction speech, you want to be able to appeal to one's emotions. Okay, and of course, you all are human beings, so you've experienced these emotions at one point or another in your life, so I don't need to go into too much detail about these emotions. However, if you want to look at more examples, guys, turn to page 343 in your textbooks, and they'll give you some examples about how to use these emotions to appeal to your audience. Okay. And then the chapter concludes with how you use emotional language, how you develop vivid examples, all of the things that we've spoken about in previous chapters. So make sure you go back and look at those, right? You want to be able to relate to your audience. That's the ultimate goal. And if you find yourself stuck, well, tell stories, right? Speak with sincerity. Speak with conviction. It's so much better to hear from somebody who can give examples from their friends' life, from their own life, right? As opposed to someone who just gives facts, right? What do I always say? Facts tell, stories sell. So if you want to sell somebody on an idea, share a story, right? So in conclusion, guys, this is the final chapter for your Fundamentals of Speech class. I'm really excited about seeing you all do your very best on Monday and throughout the week of our persuasive speeches. You guys are going to do a great job, and we will see you at the top.